is there any point in time where inference spend of the globe will become more than compute? Vamshi Ambati started research 20 years ago in AI space.
The inference market is one of the fastest growing CAGR, 94%. Around 2026, we are looking at an $80 billion market. By 2030, it's going to be a $1.3 to $1.4 trillion market. The whole big bet of OpenAI trying to build these Stargate and other big data centers is not that they just want to train on this, because that cost is a one-time cost. The entire infrastructure cost of AI today is largely going into inference.
Because when cloud came, on-prem didn't die. Else companies like Nutanix wouldn't have been born. Cloud is only 10% of all on-prem. Would it be similar that 10% of all software will belong to the model layer? Hi, this is Siddharth Aluwalia. Welcome to the Neon Show. Today I have with me Vamshi Ambati. Yeah, he has been a founder, researcher, and investor. It's a very unique journey where an individual started in research 20 years ago in AI space, and now it's all paying off, right? Welcome, Vamshi, to the Neon Show podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me, Sid. Finally, it's happening.
Yes, finally we are able to make it happen. So glad we are sitting across, and discussing things of our both of our interests, So, Vamshi, if you have to summarize the current juncture that we are today, what's happening in the macro, in the AI world with Anthropic, Claude, OpenAI, how would you summarize it to a layman, and which way do you think the industry is going in the next couple of years?
Got it. Yeah. So, to start off, it's the best time to be an AI engineer, right? So you have enormous amount of compute at your disposal. You have amazing capable models that are actually accessible to most people today. And you have, the level of sort of access and distribution that is unprecedented. You build a small app, you think of Clawbot or all these other apps that people are building today that are going from, 0 stars to like maybe 100K stars in less than a month, right? So all these three things together at a point in time where, we have this sort of trifecta of things coming together, good compute, good data, and good distribution. It's great to be an engineer, building things, experimenting quickly. And having said that, I think it's also very difficult to get things right because the same three things are accessible to everyone. So really to stand out and then build something amazing in this day and age is going to be, exciting nevertheless, right? And when I look at Anthropic, OpenAI, and others, what has happened is, like say, taking my journey as an example, I've seen or I've been in AI for about 20 years now, right? So a little more than 2 decades, right? So my undergrad, and if I have to think of it as, there were about 3 waves in AI, and I have probably been part of all 3 of them, right? So, and I'll explain what I mean by that. So typically the whole NLP and machine learning space, this was more symbolic in nature. So think of the first wave as the symbolic AI wave, right? Where you're building rules, you're thinking about how to, bring a flow chart or a logic to how you want the computer to think, right? So bringing more structure to the computer thinking. And then you have the second phase where, you went from the symbolic AI to statistical AI, because you didn't want to teach the computer through a logic diagram, but you wanted to give it a lot of examples and data and say, hey, go figure this out, right? And then the third phase where we are in right now is the neural AI, where you're not necessarily, changing a lot of things, but the scale that you're providing to these algorithms is going to, the loss of scaling and everything coming together. The compute and the data at this scale given to neural machine learning algorithms is the third wave that you're seeing today, right? And so I've been through all these 3, and then when I look at what's happening today, the pace of innovation is very different, right? So the first rule engines, you'd build these rule engines, you'd build these expert systems, if you will, and then modifying these was so difficult that it took a long time to change things, right? In the statistical phase, collecting data was difficult. Data was just not existing everywhere, for people to build, right? So you a lot of people have access to, like you were building vision models and so on, right? So you have these data sets which are like, a few hundred images, a few thousand images. So if you have to change and iterate and move things, you had to bring more data into the picture, and that was getting very expensive as well as time taking. So you wouldn't find the pace at which these models were rolled out. But what you're seeing today is a whole different beast. Every month, if you will, there is a new model, right? That's beating the old model and visibly adopted already, and people are moving to the new models. And the data is just flowing, like you're generating data, you're sort of getting access to new data created by old models and sort of improving on top of it. So it's an amazing time to be an AI researcher, as well as for someone to, someone who has seen all these three waves. It's like the pace is what is baffling me this time. So.
And where do you think the industry is going in terms of enterprise adoption? Will cloud eat up all software, as I said, because currently the SaaS prices are down?
I know. That's definitely on everyone's mind, right? So I think enterprises is a whole different beast, right? So again, this is my take, and having been the second phase of my life where I've been an enterprise AI entrepreneur, I look at it slightly differently, right? So getting enterprise right is about a couple of things. I would say enterprises don't optimize for accuracy of a model, right? So they're more so optimizing for reliability and trust. So it's very, I think in today's age, with this new level of capability that the models have, getting the accuracy right is available to everyone. But who gets the trust and reliability right in enterprise AI is probably going to, win the likes of these deals and the customers in enterprise, right? So I think the next 2 years is going to be it's a shift that is happening where if you zoom back a bit, how did enterprises move from all these waves of you have your on-prem to the cloud shift, the mobile shift, and then there is the big data shift, and then you had the predictive AI shift, right? So now with generative AI, what has happened is whatever the whole fabric that the enterprises were built on has now shaken, because enterprises, at least in the SaaS world, were about capturing workflows, right? So you had a workflow and then you're capturing it in some sense to achieve a task, right? So now generative AI is coming in and saying, I can actually generate that workflow for you, right? So then the basis under which the SaaS companies are lying is being shaken a bit. Right. Now, we have to look at SaaS different from enterprise, because at the end of the day, whatever you build, whether it's a Clawbot or whether it's generative AI apps, you're still selling it back to enterprises that are going to be using it, right? So getting that right is needed today for all the startups that are coming out. But SaaS is a whole different conversation. I think it's just a transformation that we're seeing, going from SaaS to maybe call it an intelligent SaaS or whatever, but it will transform. It will transform into a space where generative AI is going to be very integral to the workflows and the intelligent workflows that are going to be defined.
So in the previous eras, when cloud came, for example, from on-prem, so on-prem didn't die, else companies like Nutanix wouldn't have been born. And it's said that globally, cloud is only 10% of all on-prem that is there, right? So in terms of the new, the current models acceleration that we are seeing, so would it be similar that, it will be like 10% of all software will belong to the model layer?
That's a tough one to put a number on, but your intuition there is right. That what's happening is going back to the two pillars on which enterprise sales is dependent on, right? Trust and reliability. Getting these two right takes time, right? So which is why what you have seen in the cloud space, the adoption curve for these enterprises is going to be longer than what people would imagine, right? Because getting trust and reliability right takes time. It takes time for someone to say, I'm okay moving all my data into the cloud. I'm okay, moving all my compute needs to the cloud and not have and own my own data center. And then that could happen 100% in some verticals, but it may not happen in some regulated verticals. So I think the the time from new innovation hitting to enterprise adoption is going to be longer. I don't think that will change, and really that is the opportunity where people are playing, right? Now, what percentage will be owned by the model? We are starting to see more evidence that models are going to own that more than the 10%. Whether it's the new plugins that Claude has released that shook up the whole SecOps market, or the more recent sort of Clawbot that has come in, that is starting to question productivity for everyone, and then think of organizations that is very flat. So all these are good innovations, but for that to really mature into reliable and trustworthy technology is really where the current startups will have to really think. It's tough, but the advantage is towards startups who get this right, because I can't imagine an existing behemoth going back and saying, okay, now I already have your trust and reliability and everything. I can take care of that, but I'm going to reinvent and now be an AI company. That's going to be a tough sell. But a good innovative startup trying to address the trust and the reliability angle will probably be in a winning side.
When building today has become cheap, what has become valuable now?
Yeah. So when you say building has become cheap, I'm assuming that
software.
Yeah, it's the access to these models that Prompt is creating an app. Prompt can create a workflow. But I want to question that, because today I think yes, there is access to models, and then these models require a humongous amount of compute behind the scenes to really take that prompt and convert into a full-fledged running app, right? And let's just talk about that part. Imagine if the tokens prices go up by 2x, 3x, will all of us still be building those same throwaway apps, or a one-time use apps, or an app that we already have been using for a while, but we want to rethink about it? I don't think the access to compute today is gated by very few providers. And the models are definitely in the hands of like a couple of them, if you will, right? So I think it has become easy in the sense that directionally people know that this can be done, but I would still question that the access is not fully available to everyone. I, for one, in the last couple of months, when the models have gotten their reasoning capabilities, much to a different notch, what we have seen is they're consuming more tokens, and then you run out of these token limits, and then you sort of hit these limits, and you can't build your models anymore. You can't build your apps anymore. So I think they're going to get more expensive as the models get better. The compute needs are going to increase, and then you're going to get better. So it's not for everyone to build these applications. Right now, what we're seeing is sort of a teaser of what's possible, but to truly make it accessible to everyone, I think the compute has to be solved, and then we need to make sure that compute and models are actually available to everyone, right?
So, is there any effort going on where to make compute, let's say, 100x cheaper, or the price of model 100x cheaper, which is very counterintuitive to what you said? You said the price of models are going to become 2x or 3x.
Yeah. So think of the price of a token, right? So if you go into the anatomy of a token, and then the general price of what constitutes the cost, right? So there is the model training cost that has gone into the years of training, or the number of GPUs that went in, and then the scaling loss that they had to hit in order to get a better model out. So that's all baked into it. The second is, what sort of chips do you have access to while running the inference layer? Because you built your model, but now you're getting into the inference phase. And then what level of accuracy do you want out of these models? Do you want to run this in a lower quantization where it's cheaper for you to get these tokens out, but then you're losing some accuracy? So there's the cost angle. There is the sunk cost of training. Then there is the hardware sort of limits of what hardware you're running on. Primarily, it's been NVIDIA so far, but then we'll see more coming up, right? And so, when you start bringing the and then how much throughput, how many users you want to serve, and everything else. So when you start bringing all of these together, you realize that you have to sort of give and take somewhere, right? So the trade-offs are like across these 4 or 5 dimensional problem where you have to pick for your use case what works best, and where you sort of draw the. So when it comes to reasoning models, everyone wants the best model, and so you're looking at the cost going up, right? But there's definitely innovation on the software front of making like all the innovation that we've seen with the memory bottlenecks, the solving the KV cache, the disaggregated serving, where you're considering multiple kinds of hardware, one for prefill and one for decode. So there are lots of these techniques, and again, a plug is we've written up some of this as a book called Peak Inference. It's on Amazon for anyone who wants to download. A friend of mine, Rajan, and I wrote this book. So there's all this innovation on the software side, which is trying to drive the overall cost down, right? And then there's all the innovation on the modeling side, where the model's cost is going up. So you have to sort of bake that in. And then the usage is going through the roof. So more users using it for more things is obviously going to drive sort of a shortage of the tokens, right? So yes and no in different places. So it's going to get expensive in some places. The software is going to make it cheaper, but then the need is going to drive the demand higher. So there is a time in the next year and 2 where we'll start to see these act. Directionally, yes, all the token prices are going down. But as the models are maturing, we are starting to see that the opposite effect as well, where the cost is going up for the latest models.
So right now, globally, let's say AWS revenue, mostly from compute layer, is $140 billion. Right, that's the AWS revenue that's come out recently. Assuming the total cloud revenue of the entire globe is $250 billion. Seeing AWS as the leader in that, right? Do you think is there any point in time where inference revenue of the globe or the inference spend of the globe will become more than compute?
Interesting. So I've been looking at inference for more than 4 years now, right? So right before we were building Predera, where the LLM ops layer that we built was primarily focused on how do we optimize for inference. And that was the company that we exited to a data center company, where we are also now looking at these similar sort of problems and spaces. So the inference market is one of the largest or sort of fastest growing CAGR. So what we are seeing is about 94% CAGR. And then, today, I think around 2026, we are looking at an $80 billion sort of a market. But soon by 2030, it's going to be a $1.3 to $1.4 trillion market. So that market is a huge one, where we are going to be seeing, this decade is the diffusion decade for AI, right? So you're going from models that people are happy with to where are we going to figure out the end use cases. And we are starting to see already, 2 to 3 of really good use cases, like the coding being the number one. You have the voice models in, customer-facing customer support and other CS use cases that we're looking at, right? So we are seeing this decade where a lot more such use cases will be using AI, right? So this is the diffusion decade for AI. So that means inference is at the center of the conversation, right? So, and that market is growing huge. So the whole big bet of OpenAI, trying to build these Stargate and other, big data centers is not that they just want to train on this, because that cost is a one-time cost, right? So you train once, you sort of run inference for a lifetime. So that the entire infrastructure cost of AI today is largely going into inference, because the diffusion has already started, and it's only going to it's getting accelerated, I would say. So,
got it. Let's say for our users who don't come, or listeners who don't come from AI background, how do you explain them inference?
Got it. Yeah. So let's take an analogy of our brain. The human brain has a very big neural network that we've trained over decades. Add the DNA memory as well to it. But let's say the human brain is now, taking a lot of inputs and then reacting to that. Could be through one of the senses, right? So you're speaking, or you're taking some action, or you're sort of sensing or feeling a thing through the skin. So a lot of these inputs are processed in your brain. So essentially, think of the whole decades long of learning that you've done as a kid growing up, exposed to language, exposed to visual cues, all the rules and the societal contracts that you've been through. All of that is the training phase. And now you have a well-developed mind. And that is now starting to make decisions, right? So that's making decisions, that's taking actions, that's speaking words and everything else. So to me, that's inference, right? So in your own space, there's again, people say most of the learning happens in the first few years of your character forms in the 4 years and so on. But let's say even in argument's sake, you learn till 25 years. So your model is already built, right? But then think of how much of sort of decision making and then sort of activity that you do with your brain. So all of that is inference, right? So inference is nothing but how do you take all this input, process it through all your neurons, and then get that in the final outcome, right? In the large language model space, so that model training activity is essentially the training phase where you're running through thousands or hundreds of thousands of GPUs, where you're training all the parameters of your neural net, right? And that essentially during inference, you have to do this forward pass where you're going through all the parameters, computing the math to say, okay, if I see this word and that next to this there's another word, how do I then process the next word that is going to come out, right? So that prediction of that next word is what we have simplified it to in the case of LLMs, and that's inference today. And so the bigger the model size, the more expensive the inference is, because it's going to be running through that entire list of parameters to compute, what is that word coming next, right? It's the next word prediction problem, if you will. But things get complicated when you have other modalities like video and voice coming in. But by and large, think of it as, like when you have a context, predicting what comes next is the inference problem.
You mentioned that the biggest applications the world that till now have seen for inference is one is coding and the other is customer support. Why is that, right?
Yeah, so both come from, it's a very good question, and even something that I think about, like, why is it that coding has taken off in such a big way, right? Yeah. Anyone would imagine that software engineers would be the last thing to get automated, but AI went straight for it, right? So you have software. So think of just the evolution of programming, right? So you had it's very deterministic in nature, meaning you're going from your grammars that are sort of generating, and then your programs are essentially code that adheres to a certain context-free grammar, right? So in your programming language, when I look at the coding, there are two things that are happening. One is the output is so deterministic that you have a static piece of code that you can actually take and then run it anywhere and validate it, right? So when something can be brought down to that, where whatever is the level of abstraction that you're dealing with, which is English language, prompts and everything, but then that gets distilled down to a artifact that is static that you can deploy and pretty much validate. It becomes much easier to get that feedback loop right. So to me, that is one example of like why the coding has taken off. And then the second reason I think the coding has taken off is, when you look at the amount of code that people write today, there's a lot of boilerplate code, right? There's a lot of repeatability. There's a lot of reuse. The whole evolution of programming languages happened around the concept of reuse, right? You had these monolithic C programs that then had to be more reused. So you sort of brought in abstractions that became your C++, and then so on and so forth, right? That's how things evolved. So there, I feel like the two things working towards why something like coding, I can understand that part. What I don't understand is the human angle part of it, right? So places where mundane work, which is calling people, whether it's a sales calls whether it's customer support calls or like debt collection calls. In fact, like lately, I'm seeing a lot of banks reaching out with automated bots reaching out, saying like we have these offers and so on, right? So that is like, I think at this point in time, it just felt like something that's very mundane and repeatable action that humans don't want to do. They're starting to offload that to this thing. But I don't fully agree to that, because anything that has a human-to-human touch point should be the last one that should get automated. Today, we're just probably seeing that first sort of spike, but then that should probably die out soon, I feel. But these are two extremes.
But
which
customer support has companies like Sierra, Decagon, which are already almost $10 billion companies.
Yes. So I mean, the way to I guess it's the current spike, if you think of it. I mean, the models have to get extremely good so that they sort of have that empathy, they emote correctly with humans. It's very easy. Like when you get a call today from one of these robotic or agentic models, don't you sense it within like the first?
Yeah, absolutely.
It becomes so. After that, what happens to the brand association? The next time you get a call from them, you're probably going to, even if it comes from a human, you're not going to pick up, right? So I feel like it's pretty soon, before the spike dies out, we really need to see better models that sort of emote well, have that empathy angle and everything, and at the same time have the right interventions with humans, right? So if we have both, and I'm betting that companies like Sierra and others will figure this out soon. But if they don't, then I think the spike has to come down.
So in the current cycle, what do you think is overvalued and undervalued?
In the current cycle, I think in terms of, I'll speak in terms of tech more than the startups per se. So I think the agents are overhyped in the short term, but I feel maybe they will be like underhyped in like the 5-year term. So in the 5-year term, I can clearly see a lot of my day-to-day work being offloaded to agents. But the current hype around agents is such that a Clawbot releases, or a Hermes agent releases, or a or a Nemo Claw releases, and there's so much buzz around. Okay, this is going to change everything. Every company will be run by agents. You don't need a CEO anymore. You don't need like the organizational hierarchy anymore. So that's the hype part that I don't like. But I can see these sort of things happening soon, but probably in a mid to long term, but not necessarily in the short term. Undervalued, I think there was a time where we looked at like how difficult voice was to get right. I mean, even though I complain about voice not having the emotions and everything, voice to me is still going to be the frontier through which people will interact with AI. So so I was working in TTS, like text-to-speech systems, maybe 20 years ago as part of my course project. And that was so difficult to get these things right. But now, in 14, like I think Google Gemini is probably like in 140 languages or some such. It's so much easier to do the voice modality. So I think that is one that has matured, but it's not yet fully diffused, and it's ready for diffusion, but it's underhyped, I feel, a bit. So voice as well.
So you think undervalued also then?
Undervalued also. I think 11 Labs is doing okay. But imagine, a country like India, how do you think AI will get diffused? Like you have so many languages, so many dialects, so much variations and, how people sort of even say the same thing, right? So forget about the vocabulary, but, in the same language, you have so much variation. Yeah. And then the level of literacy that is required for, what used to be called digital literacy, you're not thinking about AI literacy, right? So you have to go from, how do I type things into WhatsApp versus, how do I use AI, right? So how do I use this ChatGPT? Everyone wants to know how to use this thing. And voice is a very good modality to sort of interact with AI, right? So I think the use cases are plenty for voice. It's just that I feel it's a little undervalued today.
Got it. You started your entrepreneurial journey with services and then pivoted into ML ops. But not many entrepreneurs who start in services are able to do that, are into product also. So what led you to having a successful transition?
Right. Yeah. I can't. Well, so my journey as an entrepreneur started in a more accidental way, right? So I'm an accidental entrepreneur. I didn't really set out to build a big company. I was basically always thinking that I need to test my potential a bit more. So when working at companies like AT&T Research Labs or PayPal, I felt like there's enough learning there, but then I had to push my potential a bit more. So I went to another startup that later got acquired by Zendesk, and that's where I felt like, okay, I understand what it takes to sort of go from a Series C company to get an exit to a company like Zendesk, right? Because I was leading the data science side of things, which was the big thing in 2012, 13 timeframe. But when I was really looking at, I wanted to do something different and something where I could challenge myself. I think it was more of a personal thing where my dad had some health issues. And so I was like, okay, I understand data science and I want to apply this to a place where it's more impactful and things that I could, bring back to my personal life. So that's how I wanted to just, start or do something in healthcare. And honestly, without understanding anything about healthcare, but I had the passion to learn and do something in that space. So I went to a hospital in LA and said, I'm going to just work with you for next 3 months, teach me everything about healthcare, and sort of, let me help you because I'm a data science expert. So that's how I just stayed with them for about 3 months as an in-house.
Quit your job?
Yeah, quit my job and then started off. It's pretty stupid to do that. Or when I look back,
This is 2016.
This was 2016, and I just had my my kid so it was around the same time, and then I quit my work. But it's just that passion or madness, whatever you want to call it, I think that drove me to saying, okay, I have to do this at this point. So what started as a good learning exchange between me and the hospital, and these guys were no small shop, right? So they were a fifth largest provider in healthcare. It's called Prime Health out of in US. They own about 48 or 50 plus hospitals. So it was a very good learning experience for me. And then in return, I could, from close quarters, see what does it take to work with an enterprise.
Yeah.
Why do they not trust? It's not like they, people say that healthcare is slow to adopt, right? So when it comes to tech. But I could see from close quarters why they were resistant for change. Like, why did they not move to Azure? Why were they not trusting the predictive models?
And what was the reason for that? Why were they slow?
It's a very different space, right? So talking about healthcare per se, you need to first understand how the roles lay out in the healthcare space. So you have a hospital, like in the whole, they call it the 4 Ps, right? So you have the provider, patient, pharma, and then the payer, which is the insurance company, right? So the 4 Ps. In that, the equation of how the providers, which is the hospitals, what are they for? They're looking at sort of maximizing the overall occupancy rates, how quickly they can move people, and then the legal framework around what or how the American hospital system is set up, where what are the laws that they need to abide by, and then sort of the metrics that they get penalized on, and so on. And so there are different roles for each of these, right? So there was this new role called a CAO role, which I never thought existed. It was the Chief Administration Officer, who actually oversees everything, all the metrics around the doctors, right? But when you build something, you typically build with the CTO in mind, thinking, I'm going to build this and I'm going to go and sell to the CTO. The CTO is where you sell, but then you actually get a check from CFO, but it's used by the CAO. So all of that mapping, like no one, unless you're inside, you don't really understand some of these things. So I think that exposure led me to, coming back to your question on the services side, they were like, they're starting to trust me, but then they were like, and I didn't have a clear view of a product. And they were like, okay, I want you to take on more work and then help us
Just give you more work for IT.
Exactly. So then I was like, okay, so let's start a company around it. And then
you
this
started
is an
the company
area.
later.
Exactly. Yeah.
Work.
I started out learning healthcare and then started the company 3 months later. And that was the LatentStructure, which is the services.
And how big that customer became?
So that customer, funny enough, like you need to think of your first customer not in terms of revenue, but in terms of credibility, right? So they've added so much credibility to my tag that I could actually, I didn't even have a startup at that point, but whatever I started afterwards with this knowledge that I could gain from watching close quarters, I could go to a company like a GSK, and that became my third customer.
Wow.
I went to another Parkland Health in out of Dallas, and they became my customer. I had like two more hospitals, one in Seattle and others.
So in the entire journey at Predera, right? How many of your percentage of customers were in healthcare?
Yeah, so this is where like my interest in healthcare for the first 1.5 years, and like trying to chase and land these customers, being a first-time founder, not understanding healthcare, sort of hit limitations, right? So the sales cycles are really long. Trying to gain trust, and once you are in, you need to know how to sort of leverage that and then go to the next level of revenue unlock, right? So if you don't do that, then all the hard work that goes into cracking that enterprise account really doesn't matter much, right? So all of these are learnings, and I can look backwards and say this is how it worked. But coming back to the hard part of running services and product, when you're running services, you understand all this, but you should also invest in how to capitalize on what you've built so far. Whereas what I was capitalizing for is the product that I could see, right? When I was working with multiple hospitals, I saw the same problems. Then because of the long sales cycles, we went to fintech as a vertical. So we worked with MasterCard afterwards. Then we went to pharma as a vertical, GSK. Then we went to retail as a vertical, Walmart. So working with different companies, I was optimizing for how do I now build a product out of it, right? So you can go double down into the same space and unlock more services revenue, or you could see the common pattern across and then unlock a product value. So I went the other route, trying to build, and that's when Predera was started in 2019 as a product-only company, right? So we saw all of this and then built out Predera with a view of, okay, this is the MLOps problem that we are solving, and let's give it a tag. And surprisingly enough, 2018, 19, when we started out with this product idea, I was testing the waters with, okay, let's go knock on the doors of all the VCs in Sand Hill Road and see what they think about it, right? We were welcomed in every single, all the big, the folks who were looking at AI, like Andreessen Horowitz and General Catalyst and Foundation Capital, one of your folks on the podcast. All of them looked at us. They were all pretty interested that we were looking at MLOps as a problem, because MLOps as a vertical started much later, like maybe 2020, I think, right around that time frame. We saw 5 or 6 companies come up. But we were the first wave of MLOps companies that wanted to productize this. So I wasn't in a fully successful, coming to the limitations of running services and product. It's very hard to sort of make the transition into a VC fundable product space. But then I realized that I couldn't make the transition, but I want to continue this services sector that actually feeds the real use cases to me, has the, opens the doors to these real customers. And so wanted to continue it as a bootstrapped product. So that takes a toll on you personally, but I think that transition is hopefully smoother than the VC funded transition.
Understood. And all of this could happen because you, back then the term was not coined, but you were a forward deployed founder in a hospital.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it started in a very accidental manner, turned into a services company and a product company after that. Yeah.
And when you exited, like, how much of the revenues were coming, percentage? No need to answer in absolute, but percentage were coming from services versus products?
So product, we exited very early, like I was telling you, right? So we had to make pivots. Even in the product, things changed, right? So we started out with this MLOps product, but we were innovating on the monitoring aspect of AI, because AI reliability and trust, as I keep going back to that, I think that seemed like the pillars around which enterprises are harping on. So we said, okay, let's build monitoring dashboards for AI. Let's make sure that whatever decisions are run through AI, we know exactly why they were happening that way. And so the MLOps product was starting to take shape. And funny enough that the first customer for our MLOps product was Walmart, the largest giant in retail. And they bought it not for themselves, but they wanted to open it up for all their suppliers. So it was a very big thing that could have just turned into gold for us. It did work for a good year and a half before COVID hit, and then a lot of those initiatives at Walmart sort of took a backseat. But from every crisis comes an opportunity. So we were watching very closely what was happening throughout this, and we really caught the wave of LLMs, right? So in 2022, when the LLMs came about, we were in the right mind space as a company, as well as founders, where we thought about it as this could be it, because I could clearly see, like just from my journey itself of, seeing that symbolic AI transitioning to statistical AI.
Yeah.
And that really helped my PhD shape out as well, where I could turn, my PhD was in statistical AI, even though I started my sort of grounding in symbolic AI. So when this happened, I could clearly sense that this is a sort of a shift that doesn't come across too often, right? So 2022, we said the boldest thing that we did was we did not renew the contract with Walmart, because they said, continue the MLOps product. And we said, we'll be an LLM ops company. And Walmart was not ready for LLM ops at that point. But we said, okay, fine, we'll stop this and all in with LLMs. 2023, I think like beginning of Jan timeframe. And then the open source models started to come out at that point in a small way. That really helped our journey as well. So we pivoted to this LLM ops product. And I think that shaped out. So we didn't collect too much revenue, but we had enough users on the LLM ops side that was interesting for.
So most of the revenue was coming from services side.
Yeah. So I would say the services to the split was about 15% or 20% tops for the product to the services side. Yeah. And both companies, we sort of exited in two different transactions.
But to the same?
No, different. So we sold the services separately, and then because the product company, the value of the LLM ops platform to the buyer was a lot more, so they didn't really care about the rest of the services. Yeah.
So would you advise founder to start with services if no product or problem is visible?
Interesting. So I mean, I'm a bit biased, like from what I can see, but just stepping back and thinking about what's happening with AI today. To your earlier question on if it's become so easy to build things, where does the founder focus on, right? And I think like today's AI, the problem of AI is not intelligence, but it's an integration problem, right? So you have to figure out how to integrate this into the right workflows, gain the right end users, and then sort of work with. And this is a classic enterprise sales problem, right? So, which can only be solved by forward deployed engineers like the Palantir model, or figuring out the right recipes, or let the use cases sort of come to you, where you're working on these use cases and building solutions that you can take to the customer. So all of these are kind of quote unquote solutions and services, or non-recurring engineering.
So would you call Palantir a services company or a product company?
It's a great product disguised as services. So I'm sure there's merit to the product, but the launching vehicle is services, right? Because these are hard to understand products that you have to take to the customer. There is a long lead time of getting trust in the product. All of this can only happen when you're embedded closer to the customer.
When you are forward deployed with the customer like you were, how do you ensure that you are not building a, say, just for this customer, but you are building a real company? Else you can turn out to be a one-man shop for this.
Absolutely.
Customer.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the biggest concern that any person subscribing to this direction of let's go build this FDE approach of learning the problems is, right? So I think the two things that we followed, which kept us a bit more honest to this, were the building the product ambition out. Was one, we said until we get repeatability with 5 customers, let's not think about a product, right? So that's one rule of thumb. We said, okay, let's just build it out for 5 customers. Then, the second time you work with someone in the same vertical, it should not be it should not be as difficult as the first time around, right? So if we start seeing that, then that metric is off, then you clearly don't have a product. So we were very closely guarding those 2 numbers, right? So we wanted to get applicability in a broader range across 5 customers from different verticals, and so the MLOps product really helped us get that, right? So we were working with the top 3 in every vertical, right? So whether it's a GSK in pharma or a Walmart or a MasterCard and so on, we had those bases covered. You pick the verticals we want to play in. We want to be working with one of the top 3. And then within that, once you land them, also the GTM becomes easier, right? When you sell to the best guy in that vertical, the second best guy or the third best guy is more open to talking to you, right? And then when we can do that much quicker, then you have a much better leverage as thinking about a product. Until then, I wouldn't say, don't even pretend that you're building a product, because that'll hurt you more than it'll help you, because you're basically thinking that you're building product, the cycles go there, but then they'll really just start to look like multiple products and not just one single product.
Any other learnings, Vamshi, that you have from your journey that you could share with founders?
On the enterprise AI side, I think the biggest learning is, so I'll speak about it from the startup angle, because it's often people, the question that I get asked very often is, how is it that you landed some of these big names, right? I didn't have a sales team. I didn't have a marketing team. It was purely with the products that we were building and then the ability to deliver, right? So I think the 2 simple things I can say from my journey of sort of distilling that sort of know-how is, one, enterprises are actually looking for solutions to their problems, and quite often what happens is the big companies that they're working with, the managers, the VP and below levels, like the directors and managers, they actually don't approve of the call it the big 5 or the different firms that come and pitch large solutions, big PowerPoint decks. They don't get their trust, right? And they look at that and say, okay, if you're forced to take this company and work with it, we'll do it. But is there someone else that is solving this, right? So if you can position yourself as someone who goes in with that level of authenticity, goes in and honestly says, I'm good at this particular piece, I don't know the other pieces, but can you position yourself to solve their problem? They will trust you. They will trust you, and then they will come back and tell you, hey, can you customize it this way? Can you do it that way? Because then they know that they can work with you, they can talk to you, right? So you need to, be open to that, find those opportunities where they're unhappy with these, the big pitches, right? So that is one that I've learned from my journey, if I can distill it. First build that trust, and then you yourselves can be that sort of beacon of trust where you're going in and then sort of helping, right? The second thing is, don't be shy going to the biggest names in the bucket, right? It took me 9 months to land Walmart, right? But I've known people who have spent years and still couldn't get into Walmart, right? But we had the right product. We could approach them with in a point of trust where we could work with them and sort of were going in with something that we were really good with, and then sort of open to making changes in the way that we wanted, right? So whatever it takes, like how much effort is required, just go for the first, the top 3 at least, right? So then good things will fall after.
And how did you transition from a technical and a research founder to a sales, leading sales in your organization?
With a lot of scars on the back. It's, so, I mean, it's good and bad, right? So when I walk into a room with a customer, they don't look at me as someone coming to sell them, but someone coming in to solve their problem,
Yeah.
right? So that trust comes from my technical background, right? So that definitely helps sort of position myself in that. But then there comes a point where the sale doesn't move forward. There comes a point when you need to step up that game of, I'm going to follow up, I'm going to understand, I'm going to sort of read the room correctly, I'm going to, sort of, take what it takes to play what it takes to sort of close the deal,
Yeah.
right? So those really, the first few, I mean, I traveled the first 1.5 years of running the services firm. I went all across US. I drove literally 50,000 miles in my car, just going to people and talking to people and trying to understand, and then being very critical about myself and where my shortcomings are, right? So then it was clear that, okay, sometimes in some deals you need to go as two people, not one. And sometimes you need to follow up at the right points in time, right? So sometimes you're like, you shouldn't speak, like you need to be quiet and listen to their pain points. So all these took a good year and a half of talking to a lot of, I think the failed deals taught me a lot more than the deals that I won. So that's just being self-critical at different points.
Well, thank you, Vamshi. It's been phenomenal to record this podcast with you. Thank you for sharing your journey super candidly.
Thanks. Yeah, I think if at all my journey helps, another entrepreneur in the same space, I'm always happy to sort of help and talk to them. And as I said, I have this thing called Virama Ventures, through which I support founders who are sort of in similar spaces where I sort of identify and I'm passionate about. So always happy to talk. And thanks for the opportunity to talk to you guys.
Thank you so much, Vamshi.